Hopefully you can hear it. All right, it's clear, right? Dependency injection is a way to decouple your code. Oftentimes, to do something, you have to depend on other things, a database, a file system, and you don't want those to be very tightly coupled into your program. So dependency injection allows you to pass those dependencies into your function so you can do great things with it. I'll give you another example. So imagine that your kid was your program, and if you didn't have dependency injection, basically you would have to take your refrigerator all the time and just say, go for it. And you can imagine all the chaos that would ensue. So with dependency injection, you still make your program happy, but you can provide it with whatever food you want, wherever you want. So that's another way to think about it, is you control what your program's getting. All right, so why would you use this? It's going to help you reuse components across projects, even within the same project. It's going to let you test easier because you're going to be able to swap out implementations. And even in production, or as you move through environments, you'll be able to swap out the implementation. It also makes your code more readable by taking those out. You can also shield your own code from API changes, so it's kind of an adapter or translator from your dependencies, and sometimes it helps you from having to pass down a whole bunch of stuff throughout your program. So when are you going to use this? You're going to use it when you want to loosely couple your components. You want independent things that are very specialized. Another way to do that kind of thing is through event emitters, as Brady was talking about, but this is an instance where you don't want to use event emitters and you want to actually have a reference in there, but you want those components to be independent. You can also think about this as separating your layers. So you have your database layer, that would have a set of components, you have your domain logic, and you can inject your persistence layer services into your domain logic and keep them loosely coupled. You can also use this to inject configuration. I do this between environments. You can use a configuration file rather than having to go into your code to make any changes. If you're going to use the same dependency with multiple components, again, you want to modularize it and inject it. So there's a few other things, but I think we'll get on to when you don't want to use it. This is when you're never going to have a different implementation. It does what it does, it needs these dependencies, and you don't really need to configure that stuff. You can definitely have a more direct connection to your dependency. So you may be thinking, oh, well, doesn't CommonJS do this for us? Isn't that dependency injection? Not really, because as soon as you change that reference, you've changed the code. And the idea with dependency injection is you don't change your code, but you get a different implementation as you run it. So it's a runtime change rather than a code change. I highly recommend, especially on the server side, Architect.js. It's used by Cloud9. They have Cloud IDE. They use this extensively. I've used Architect for a few years now. It's really cleaned up my code, made it very modular, very easy to work with. You can also use this on the client side, but a lot of the frameworks have their own ideas of dependency injection, so you're getting the benefits without having to roll your own. So, for example, Angular has dependency injection for... All right, so let's look at some code here. Maybe. Down here. All right. So I have a node project, and this is, you can think of it as this Express application, and I have my plugins in this directory. The example that I have on the server side is I want to generate a whole bunch of random names. So I have the logic to actually generate the random names. I have a plugin that does the randomization. I have a plugin that can load that data into the database. I have another plugin that can save it as a CSV. So all of those can be reused with really any project because they're independent. And I essentially merge them together. Yeah, and I can essentially merge them together through Architect and this configuration file. Now, there's a lot of dependency injection libraries out there, and they all have slightly different ways of doing it, but the idea is the same. You have some sort of container, which is a representation of your application. Then you have configuration that tells it, okay, here are all of the services or all of the components, and this is how they're wired together. Okay? So with the plugins, you have a list. Each one of these represents a package, an independent bit. So this is how I do my console logging. It gives me pretty output. This is how I do the randomization, and you can kind of guess by the names what the other stuff does. Down here, you'll see that I'm passing in some options at runtime. So I can, without changing any code, I can change the file name, I can change if it's going to output to a file or save to the database. I can do all that through configuration. So if I want to have a different configuration for my test environment versus my production environment, I can very easily do that through declaring it here rather than having to dig into the code or having a lot of logic within my application that will modify the behavior. So each one of those, like I said, is a package by itself. So let's look at the name generator itself. The name generator, the most interesting thing is this plugin component of the package JSON. So we're just piggybacking on already what Node uses to describe a package, and we're saying it's consuming all of these services that I've configured, and it's providing this particular service to whoever wants to use it. And as you might imagine, it doesn't care what the implementation is behind that. So I can switch that out whenever I want as long as the interface is the same. So that's what makes this very nice is when I'm testing, I can swap this out and I don't actually have to write to the file system if I don't want to. If I find a new NPM library that I want to use, as long as I provide the same interface, it's going to work. All right, let's talk about the implementation of it. In a lot of ways, you can roll your own dependency injection by just writing good functions. So your function should take whatever it needs, so it's a pure function. It's only operating on what you're giving it. It's not depending on state outside of itself. Architect uses that same thing. It's going to pass in the options from the configuration file. It's going to pass in all the services that you've said you need. And then once everything's set up, it's going to register those services for other plugins to use. Then you have your implementation. Whatever implementation you want, I've said here is my service and here's its interface, and I'm going to provide that to the other components in the environment. Okay? So in a lot of ways, when you're writing these plugins, you're only thinking it's doing this one thing and it has these services. Those services have an interface and it's just going to operate on that. And you can think very clearly about where my dependencies are. So as an example of one of the benefits, if I look at the test for this, you can ignore the mocking stuff that I'm doing, but I have a service that I want to use. So I'm just instantiating that service as a dependency in the system, and then I'm injecting that. So I don't even have to use Architect to do the testing. I'm simply calling the plugin function. I'm providing it options in the test. I'm providing it an object with all the services, and then I'm creating that service and then testing it down here. So I have full control over what that particular plugin has access to during testing, just like I have full control over what it has access to during runtime, because I can configure that stuff. Okay, same principle goes for my database. It consumes services, it provides a service with an API, and I can test that, or I can construct that interface in the plugin and provide that to the service. Okay? So that was a quick example. I do have an example of how to use it on the client side, but I'm sure I'm over time at this point. So if you're interested, we can talk after. Oh, okay. All right. I'll give you a quick example of what that looks like. I have a simple, actually I have it up over here. I'm using old school AMD just to keep it simple. I have my configuration file that I pass over to the client. That looks very similar to what we saw before. I'm saying here are the packages that I want to pull into my application. I'm going to use Architect to make an application. Then here's an example of what the plugin looks like. Instead, it doesn't have the concept of a package JSON, so I have to tell it what service it's providing. It has the same function signature for the plugin itself. It takes options, it takes a list of services and a register function, and then I'm just returning that plugin. And here's an example. I am providing the same math service, but this one has advanced logic. So in addition to basic math functions, this one handles square root and logs and stuff like that. It's providing the same service, different interface to allow the system to do more advanced things. Okay? And that's it. I'm just going to wrap it up. So you can see all that in the presentation in this repo. And that's it. You're ready to take the red pill. Questions? Yes.
Do you use this in all your projects?
I do. Makes it super clean.
Big file just is like
I typically do that when the configuration is more or less a static object that I just want to encapsulate and say, this is stuff that it needs to just bootstrap.
so like scalars. It's like 500 or 7 value. That probably goes in a config
Yeah,
file.
if it's really not going to change, then you can put it in the package and you can control it like the rest of the source code. Anything that you want operators or other developers to be able to tweak, or you want to be able to tweak at runtime, you would want to pass in through the configuration file. Do I have an example? Not off the top of my head, but what I tend to do is if there's a difference in the production code or environment codes, then I'll use environment variables. Where's my splitter? There it is. So because this is a JS file, I can use an environment variable to pass that in. So you do process env, and you'd say, right? And that way, I'm controlling it through process variables rather than environment variables instead of hard coding it here. And that is usually the recommended way. You can do some conditional logic and have multiple versions of the config file, but that tends to get a little messy. So other questions?